If you're a fan of sci-fi horror video games, well, you're in luck. We're kind of about to go through this renaissance of games that take a lot of inspiration from EA's 2008 classic, Dead Space. And chief among that list of games is a remake of Dead Space itself. Go figure. I'm Giovanni Colantonio, I'm the gaming section lead here at digitaltrends.com, and I recently got a chance to play a pretty sizable chunk of the Dead Space remake, which is scheduled to launch next January. Now, I got to play the first 3 chapters of this game, and that's about 4 hours of gameplay, so I have a pretty good idea of how this thing is shaping up. For fans of the original, the good news here is that this is a very faithful remake so far. It's not really taking a ton of elements from Dead Space 2 and 3 and shoving them into this game where they don't belong. Instead, it's really sticking close to the script. A lot of the story beats are pretty much exactly how I remember them, but the main difference here comes from the tech upgrades, and some of those upgrades are pretty sizable. Now, some of them are really clear immediately. When you look at this footage, you're probably going to notice right away that it looks a lot better. But I also think that a lot of that stuff is invisible and you maybe won't notice, but I think it's really the most interesting part of it and it's worth calling out. I'll get to that, but let's start with the obvious part. Yeah, it looks a lot better. This remake is pretty gorgeous compared to the original Dead Space, which by comparison looks a lot more dated than I remembered. When I started looking at the footage back to back and looking at Isaac Clarke's character model, for instance, that's a really good example where you see it. Clarke in the old game kind of looks like a plastic Stretch Armstrong figure when you compare it to the new model, which is incredibly detailed. I really started to notice that anytime I got splashed with necromorph blood. I would kind of zoom really close into Clarke and see these individual splatters on the metal parts of his armor, or see it caking into the mesh fabric. It's really incredible, even if that probably sounds a little bit morbid. But it's not just the graphical fidelity that makes a difference here, it's a lot of the smaller details too. For example, you see a lot more particle effects in this. If there's a wire frayed on the wall, for instance, you'll see a bunch of sparks coming off it. You'll see way more dynamic lighting, which just makes the USG Ishimura feel a lot more tense and really pump up the horror. And then you'll also get these kind of pockets of ambient fog through the ship, which add a lot of atmosphere. A lot of those details just make this game feel a lot different. I mean, it doesn't feel like you're walking into a ship room that's four-walled with a couple of objects in it. Instead, you're really feeling like this is a dynamic and changing space. Now, there is a lot more detail in the art design too. You'll see a lot more things when you enter these rooms that really help them feel like more lived-in spaces. And my favorite part of that is seeing these little propaganda posters on the wall every once in a while. They've added in these kind of almost 1960s-esque posters all over the wall, which kind of give a sense of the work-life balance, or lack of it, I guess, that was on the Ishimura. And little details like that, I think, go a long way to making this feel like a more lived-in space with a little bit more environmental storytelling. It almost reminds me a little bit of the recent Prey remake in 2017. There's just a lot more going on that you can glean by walking around. Now, the biggest change here is one that's actually kind of invisible. The Dead Space remake includes what's called an intensity director, and basically what that is an invisible dial working behind the scenes to kind of change the experience every time you go through it. Now, what does this intensity director actually do? Well, it controls a lot of things. For instance, it can control if an enemy spawns, what kind of enemy spawns, where it spawns, but beyond that, it can also change the lighting in a room. It can change what's happening in it with sound, and those things open up a lot of potential for this. Now, when I spoke to the developers at EA Motive, they gave me some examples about what this looks like in action. If that dial is cranked up all the way, and maybe you go down the ship and go to some rooms that you had gone to previously, it might completely change. You might walk into a room and a bunch of enemies might spawn that weren't there before. Or you might walk in and all the lights will be shut off and you'll hear these kind of whispers in the room. Things like that, I think, really are going to be the most impactful change here, because this is a horror game. And with horror games, you want them to be scary. But the problem with video game horror games is that often you're kind of left a little not scared. You know, if you go through the game a second time, you know where all the scares are going to happen. If you die in a boss fight, well, you're going to respawn and you're going to know where all the enemies spawn in, and, well, that's it. But this really could change things. If you die in a fight, yeah, you could maybe go to that vent where that enemy spawned earlier, but it might not spawn there. It might spawn behind you instead, and that has the potential to add some real scares to this game. I'm excited to see how that turns out. I'm excited to see what that does for replays of it and how much it can make this game feel new and unpredictable. Now, if you're a fan of the Dead Space series, you probably want to know about the combat and the violence by extension. The original Dead Space is really known for its hyper-violence, but beyond that, it's also known for its almost puzzle-like combat. You had weapons like the plasma cutter that could hack off individual limbs, which added this interesting component to the game where you could kind of knock off an enemy's leg to get it off balance and put some space between you and it. That does return here, and not only that, EA Motive has gone to great lengths to make that even more gruesome, but in a really practical way that I love. Basically what they've done is they've added this new flesh layer system to the game, where you can kind of peel back individual layers. In the original game, if you shoot an arm off, you kind of shoot it clean off, and that's kind of it. Cool, you solved the puzzle. In this, every time you shoot, you kind of peel back layers of flesh and bone, and that makes for this really raw, grotesque image that's more violent than the original, but it also just kind of makes the gameplay more visceral. You really feel like you're taking a lot of effort to get through these limbs, and you also get this interesting feedback where you kind of really feel like you're hacking away at it. It puts a little effort into the combat, and from what I've played so far, that's really cool. It also makes some of the weapons that weren't great at hacking limbs off in the original game way more useful again. The machine gun-like rifle, for instance. In the original game, it's kind of just a bullet sponge thing. You kind of pump it into enemies until they die, but in this you can actually point at limbs and peel parts off, and that made me want to use those weapons a lot more than just maybe equipping the line gun and calling it a day. You even see it in the flamethrower, where you can kind of see flesh starting to peel off when you melt enemies, which is disgusting, and I love it. Now, there's a lot more that's upgraded in this game too that was really notable during my session. For example, the zero gravity completely changed in this game. In the original one, you would just kind of jump from surface to surface, which didn't quite feel right, but now the remake lets you kind of fly around like its sequels did, and that makes those segments feel a lot more intense. It also just kind of makes them feel like I remember them feeling like, which is great for a remake. You really want a remake like Dead Space to keep the feeling of the original, but modernizing it in a way that kind of fills in the gaps. You also get a fully voiced Isaac Clarke in this one, as Gunnar Wright from Dead Space 2 and 3 comes back to take on the role, and that's a cool change too. The original game, Isaac Clarke kind of just felt like one of those classic broody, strong and silent types, but he gets a little more character here. He's not the most exciting guy, but at least we get to hear him talk. Now, there were still some problems when I played this game. It's clear that it's not fully done yet. There were a lot of frame rate issues. I saw characters kind of breaking through walls or attacking me through floors, but a lot of that stuff is to be expected. This is an early build of the game, and it's not scheduled to come until January. But it really does seem like a lot of these tech changes are really pushing the limits of the tech here, so I'm interested to see how it functions when it finally comes out. Even with that little caveat, I'm really impressed by what I got to see in Dead Space so far. It feels exactly like the original game, but I think that the changes that have been made here are really smart just to give it a little bit of a modern edge and push its horror even more. I like how faithful this is to the original, and I especially like that it's sticking to the horror premise here. I was kind of worried that this might go in a more action direction, but it's really cool to see the classic Dead Space with all of its scares intact. Now, I know that Halloween is right around the corner, but based off what I've seen in Dead Space so far, it looks like it might come a little bit early in 2023. Prepare to have your pants scared off in January when Dead Space officially launches.